from the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University, and welcome to this week's podcast. And this one is by request, as many of them are, and it's a fascinating request, an important request, a request and a topic that I think is important to consider in international higher education and international higher education studies. The topic for this week is the Research Master's degree. And indeed, the Research Master's degree has been hit through some very hard times in the last decade or so. The big brother of the doctorate really has taken over. Why indeed would you do a Research Master's degree if you qualify to do a PhD? And that's a great question, and I really can't come up with many answers to that, so that's why this is a great podcast, because we were asked to talk about the Research Master's degree for students and for supervisors by the wonderful Marilyn on Twitter. So a big hello to Marilyn, and we promised that together we would try and come up with some answers for you in an area that is under-researched at the moment. And yes, I did mention we would discuss it. I'm joined once more by my beloved and extraordinary husband, Professor Steve Redhead, who is also the Professor of Cultural Studies at Flinders University. And why Steve and I perhaps are quite a good wrestling tag team on this one is both of us have supervised a hell of a lot of master's and doctoral degrees, but also we both did a research master's degree and a PhD, and that's a rare combination, I think, these days. So good morning, Steve.
Good morning, Tara.
And how interesting from Marilyn that we would get this request. It is a great area, and let's just start with the basic one for perhaps students who are thinking about entering a master's program or a PhD. What do you see as the key difference between a research master's degree and a PhD?
Well, I think technically, there are the differences of length of thesis, and most PhDs are sort of 80 to 100,000 words, depending on regulations at particular universities, and most master's theses by research are about 50-odd thousand.
Correct.
So there is a difference.
Length, it's about half, yes.
Yeah, there is a difference. And the original contribution to knowledge of a PhD, which is still argued about in PhD studies, is the difference between a PhD and a master's. But that blurs. I do think there is a question of blurring of a 50-odd thousand word thesis, to what extent that doesn't provide an original contribution to knowledge, for example. But I think those two things are the big difference.
Yes, you're right. I mean, the paradigm is different, the regulations are different, the length is a determinant before we start. But how I always argue if a student should do a research master's or a PhD is I believe it should be topic-led. So if the topic is a synthesizing topic, so you're looking at already existing knowledge and offering an innovative interpretation, or indeed applied research often doesn't provide the originality, but you're taking already existing stuff and you're applying it to a case study. Often they were research master's degrees, synthesising knowledge. The PhD went beyond the synthesis to an original contribution to knowledge. Where you're right, and you and I have never actually had this conversation, but when I submitted my research master's degree at the University of Western Australia in a traditional discipline, and we might talk about that the research master's for both of us was in a very traditional discipline. The PhD was in an interdisciplinary area. But when I submitted my research master's degree at UWA in history, very traditional history, my examiners said, why in God's name isn't this a PhD? This is absolutely ridiculous. It is an original contribution to knowledge. It is changing a discipline. She's been poorly advised. Did you have anything similar in terms of thinking about your own experience with your research master's, which was very rare in law at the time, and the PhD?
Yeah, I think, certainly in my case, I did do a research master's, by thesis.
Yeah.
And I thought at the time that I was actually going to go on to a PhD after that. So I saw it in some ways as a research training in that. And at one time, You could register for a PhD direct without having to start with an MPhil, for example, in England in a lot of universities, if you had a research master's. So there was that kind of thinking. But it was at a very early stage of what became socio-legal studies, sociology of law, which really blasted apart the traditional law curriculum for a master's. And I think, although it started off as a specific study within administrative law, which I'd done very well in my original honours degree, it rapidly became a socio-legal, sociology of law study of administrative tribunals, which was basically a series of empirical researches around those tribunals and a capturing of developing theory in things like criminology and sociology of law. So it became an interdisciplinary thing from a very traditional discipline and from a very traditional faculty of law at the University of Manchester. So I think there are interesting things about what I did, but also it did have, for quite a long time, a kudos of being a research training for the eventual thing, which of course was the big PhD. That's how people thought of it.
And of course, we've gone back in Australia, particularly, I'm thinking about the Monash examples or the Melbourne examples, where that is that stepping stone. One of the ways you get a PhD through in 3 years is you make sure there is a master's degree in some form that provides that stepping stone. But just to go back to that originality variable, if I can, which was always the deal breaker for me. If a student came with a synthesising project, that's a master's. They came with a spark of originality, either empirically or most often through theory or interdisciplinarity, that's a PhD. Looking back on your research masters now, 2020 hindsight, was that a PhD actually?
It wasn't far off when I look at it now. Yeah, it wasn't far off. I think it was about 54,000 words. Another 20 would have made it a PhD. There was a huge original contribution to knowledge in it.
Right, so that's important, I think, for students making that decision and determination now. And we're going to come back to that because, remember, a research master's degree in the UK and also in Australia, different systems around the world, but a research master's is 2 years and a PhD is 3 years. So for 1 year of your life, why wouldn't you do a PhD? And that's when I'm advising students as the Dean now. I say to them, why would you want a research master's? And there are some great answers to that. If the extra year makes a difference to you, absolutely. But also, there used to be, when I did a research master's, why I decided to do that from a first class honours, I could have gone straight to do a PhD at UWA, is the research master's at that time was more employable. So if you looked at the data set for employability, a master's degree is the most employable qualification you can do. But remember, that was a long time ago. Now with degree inflation, the PhD in some ways is the research master's of 20 years ago. So thank you for that, Steve. That's important. Let's now move to supervisors if we can. Now, is a research master's degree and a PhD, are they supervised differently?
I have supervised them differently, I must admit. Partly because as I say, I think in many ways, certainly in the past, research masters have been training for the big PhD. Didn't have to be the same sort of subject area, but I think they were a distinct thing. So there was, for example, in law, an LLM, which was a very marketable, employable credential, was different from a PhD, and I think that's still the case. And so in the various areas that I've supervised, criminology, cultural studies, philosophy and so on, I've always thought of them as distinct in terms of supervision, partly because I wasn't trying to get an original contribution to knowledge out of the student, but I was seeing it as a way of training a student to do research when they hadn't done that in their honours.
So I'm thinking about, for example, going back to your work at the MIPC, the Manchester Institute for Popular Culture at MMU, where you actually did have a large group of master's students.
I did, yeah.
With doctoral students as separate.
Across the university, in fact, in various disciplines.
That's right. And when you've talked about remembering those times, you focused very strongly on those students enrolled, particularly in sociology, who were doing field work. We're doing ethnography and ethnographic field work. And you very much have talked about with me the scaffolding, the research training to make sure they got the most out of that field work. Is that an example?
Yeah, it is, definitely. So there were people who I supervised who did do masters and came out with masters. Although they might have thought about going on to PhDs, they actually got jobs either in the creative industries or in higher education. Yeah. But they were thinking of doing the thing eventually as a PhD. We had a lot of PhD students who came to us from all over the world. But actually, at the time, a lot of those master's students were hoping to go on, either in the same area or in a different area, to a PhD. So I was aware that they wanted to do that, and I was trying to get them up, as you say, in the best possible way, especially in the fieldwork like ethnography that we specialised in, to a point where they could in fact go on and do a PhD. But some of them, and some of the best students, only did masters.
Because they got a job from it. And just a reminder, the difference of the British system in particular, a lot of students, particularly in the former polytechnics, the new universities, enrolled in an MPhil, a rare qualification in Australia. An MPhil, did 2 years, and then would go through a formal upgrade meeting.
That's exactly
and
right.
I certainly did a lot of those when we were in the UK last time, and it very much is looking for, has the student got the intellectual ability, has the topic got that originality?
Yes.
And they're deciding at 2 years.
Yes, will the topic provide that they were doing anyway in a master's, were they going to be able to stretch that to a PhD and an original contribution to knowledge?
Yes, and of course that's the exact opposite of how I would supervise, because at the start I would look at the topic, look at the student, and know if they get there. And I think a good supervisor can call it early.
Yeah.
A good supervisor knows if they can call it early. So, Steve, and again, this is another question about supervision, and I think it really matters because we don't talk about the supervisory andragogy enough, I don't think. We forget that this is teaching and learning. We forget that supervision is teaching. Do you think that a good master's supervisor and a good PhD supervisor are different things? Or are they, let me phrase that a different way. Does a research master's supervisor perhaps have different characteristics from what's required for a PhD supervisor? Are there differences in supervision there?
Yeah, I think there are, partly because the thing, the master's by thesis, the master's thesis, is a distinct thing. So I think it doesn't normally have that original contribution to knowledge, but it's way bigger and way better than an honours thesis. And obviously a lot of honours degrees actually have theses within them, and that might be 20,000 words, just for example.
Correct.
But the 50,000 masters, I think, is a distinct thing. Yes, so that requires distinct supervisory techniques.
And if I could add one particularly to that, I think time management matters a lot. I mean, I'm a big believer, and I've said this in hundreds of podcasts and vlogs that we've done, a PhD is 3 years. And if students are talking to supervisors, you need to only be talking with supervisors who have a track record of getting students through in the minimum time. This is becoming more and more and more and more important because time is a proxy for supervisory quality.
It is.
Does the supervisor know what they're doing? If they're letting students go on for 4 and a half or 5 years, that is poor supervision, and I hold the supervisor responsible. Very easy to blame the student. Now, so I think a 3-year PhD, that's what we're dealing with. But because there's less time with a master's, the supervisor has to know a lot more and how to truncate a quality research training experience for those students. So in some ways, the pressure is on even more. So maybe time management is even more significant?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. One of the major skills of the supervisor is time management.
And also, as you've said, being able to pack out research training much more overtly, I think, in a research master's portfolio. Really interesting there. So how do you think the topics themselves differ for a master's degree and a PhD? We've already talked about the synthesis versus the originality. Do you think are there any other differences? I often see the research masters as more applied knowledge, although interestingly the professional doctorate, the prof doc, is increasingly applied knowledge. So that's starting to blur a bit too. So applied knowledge, often case studies perhaps, Steve.
Yeah.
Anything else that you'd see as a difference in the topic that would say to you that is a research master's? Yeah,
I think it's difficult, especially as you in any particular discipline, the PhDs themselves are proliferating.
Yeah.
Because it's much more common for someone to do a PhD, in a particular subject. I mean, you take law and social legal studies, which I was talking about originally for my own masters. There are many more topics within both masters and PhDs there, but I think mostly there is the danger of that blurring.
Yeah.
And the supervisor really has to know whether the particular topic will stretch to be a PhD, and the student has to know that they're interested enough to study for at least 3 years in a particular topic. With a master's originally in the UK was a year, not 2 years.
That's right.
So that you could pretty much say this is the sort of boundaries of the topic, and you could do this in a year's master's.
Absolutely.
The 3-year PhD is really something else, partly because that student has to sustain themselves in terms of interest and quality and rigour for at least 3 years. That's incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah. And also, if I can just go back to my soapbox once more and talk about the importance of time management in a research master's and a PhD. Why time matters so much is students need to know what they're getting into. So if they're enrolled in a research master's, that is 2 years. It's not 2.5, and it's not 3 years from dodgy time management and bad supervision, and also the student not being disciplined either. It is 2 years. Because if the student is taking 2.5 years to do a master's degree, they should have taken 3 years with good supervision and done a PhD.
Absolutely.
So making sure that the project is bounded, the supervisor and the student are both on the same page about expectations.
Absolutely crucial.
That's really, really crucial, I think. Now, next question, which again, I've never seen talked about in the literature at all, Steve. So let's spruik this out and see what we can come up with. And it's interesting because I've got a research master's on the floor in our lounge room to examine in the next week. Are PhDs and research masters examined differently?
I certainly have examined them differently. Again, the crucial thing is an original contribution to knowledge. What you're looking for in that master's thesis is not that. You're looking for other things. Whatever you're looking for, it's not an original contribution to knowledge. Whereas the PhD original contribution to knowledge is in some ways absolutely essential.
Is the deal breaker.
Yeah.
So what I'm doing when I'm about to examine this master's, and please correct me, isn't it great to be thinking through this now, is when I'm examining a master's, I'm focusing very strongly on the academic protocols being in place. So, is the writing of very high quality? Have we got citations and the referencing, all that fantastic? Are they able to construct and sustain an argument? Is it well structured? Are they mobilising evidence in an interesting way? So all of those characteristics, I think, you sort of almost take those as read in a PhD, whereas in the master's, that becomes the sort of area you're looking at, because I'm after a sustained, coherent, high-level article, a high-level argument over 50,000 words. That's what I want to see. How am I going? Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think there's a definite difference in a bibliography. I read PhDs and research master's theses backwards, so I read the bibliography first, and I'll go back to it, having read it once. There's a massive difference, I think, in a PhD bibliography and a master's bibliography.
Yes, and of course it's always very hard to quantify that, but I remember one of my wonderful students looked at my PhD this week, and of course my PhD, as you've seen, is a very large beast, but my PhD has 210 pages of a bibliography. 210 pages, not items. Whereas in a master's, you could probably get away with a 30-page bibliography.
Yes, and also you're not looking for comprehensive literature. You're looking at, I think, more specialised bibliography in a master's, a much, obviously, quantitatively bigger, but also qualitatively bigger PhD bibliography. I think a big difference.
I think that's crucial. And I'd never thought about it in that way. So the bibliography for a master's is tighter.
Much tighter.
It's tighter. It's creating almost like a slice of cake. It's not the whole cake, and that slice of cake you want well worked.
You do.
Very, very nice. The interpretation I want at a very high level too in a master's. That's really useful, Steve. So we've got a lot of people who listen to these podcasts all around the world. And Steve, the final stop, I think, of our gig this week is for a student approaching this issue. Remember, the average age of a research master's and a PhD student getting into a program these days is 34 years of age.
Wow,
right?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so there's a lot of 34-year-olds out there. That's an average, though. We've got our usual 21, 22, 24-year-olds, and we've got our fantastic crew who are 70. Bless you, we love having you in the program. But for people at this point listening to this and saying, am I going to enrol in a research master's or a PhD, what would you say to them, Steve?
I think it's really difficult because if you've got a research master's, if you've done a research master's and you've moved on to a PhD, you're going to find the whole thing so much easier.
I know.
PhD is, as I've always argued, is a really elite qualification, and it's not possible for everybody to do. It really is an elite qualification, partly because it creates an elite.
Yes.
There are real difficulties in doing it. Some of those difficulties and some of the sort of loneliness of the long-distance PhD student is actually prefaced by doing a research master's.
Yeah.
I really do think there's a lot in that. So if you could do it, if you could do both, then that's the ideal. And I realise through finance and for all sorts of other reasons, it's less likely that people will do it these days. And in some cases, you have to look at the discipline area, and law is a good example. A lot of people lecturers and professors don't have PhDs in law, for example. They have masters. They often have masters by research.
Yeah.
I think it partly depends on the topic, but if you can do both, then really that's the ideal.
Look, it is true, and look, I will agree with that. I did my PhD, half of which was while I was in full-time work, in 18 months.
Yeah.
And it is an enormous thesis. The examiners describe it as one of the greatest PhDs ever read. A new voice in cultural studies was discovered.
Yeah.
They're the most amazing report you'll ever read. But the reason I really knew what I was doing, and I could truncate the length of time with basically no supervision at all. I did it all 3 o'clock in the morning in a cellar flat in Wellington, is because I'd done a research master's degree in an elite university in a specialist traditional discipline with all the protocols in place. So I knew what it looked like. I got the system, I got the structure, and I could do it quickly. Yeah. Now, I don't think that would be possible anymore. The scale of the fees that are being charged around the world now,
right.
You couldn't take a 2-year master's and then do a 3-year PhD.
No.
What I think matters, therefore, for you guys making a decision about this, and I'm getting stauncher about this as I get older, is it's all about the selection of supervisors. I think people focus very strongly on the sort of university, or is it a posh university or not. That's useless. It's not about the elite university at all. Some of the horror stories you and I have had emails from wonderful students around the world have been from some of the best universities in the world, where the staff have just treated them disgracefully.
Absolutely.
And they've had to leave the program, but they tried to stay as long as they could because it was in a posh university, and actually there was bad supervision there.
Yeah.
So everything is the selection of supervisors. So I always say the PhD students need to remember they are very, very valuable. Every university wants you. So you can pick which university you go to, and your absolute deal breaker should be, can this supervisor deliver a completed PhD in the minimum time? Have they got a good track record? Yeah. And you know what? I would ask to talk to other students they've supervised. I would really go into that level of detail, because maybe the research master's degree now, unless you're going to do a PhD following it, probably it's not worth doing. I would argue. If it's taking 2 years of your life, take 3 and get a PhD.
Yeah.
But the only way you're going to do that these days, because as Steve said, you're lacking that deep research training, is if you've got a supervisor who really knows what they're doing.
Yeah,
so have I been fair on that?
Yeah, you've been absolutely fair, and it's the crucial variable.
It is the crucial variable. It is the deal-breaking variable in your life. So really, research master's, PhD is not really the conversation anymore. No. Are you able to get the very, very rare group of elite supervisors who can deliver a thesis in the minimum time? That is what we need to be talking about.
Yeah.
And of course, those completion rates and so forth are often very invisible because universities around the world are hiding them.
Yeah.
And they're hiding them for good reason.
Yeah.
And we need to be celebrating the outstanding supervisors who are really delivering the heavy lifting work to get those theses over the line, Steve.
That's right, I agree.
Thank you so much, wonderful Marilyn, for your great suggestion. I hope we've helped, and I hope it's been useful for our colleagues out there who are thinking, I used to supervise research masters. I wonder what happened to those. And so it's an interesting time, huge time of flux in research higher degrees. And Steve, thank you very much for that really interesting conversation.
Thank you.
For more information about the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University, please refer to www.flinders.edu.au/graduate-research.